Hello, and welcome to the Composition API course. My name is Daniel Kelly, and I'm excited to be going over the ins and outs of the Composition API together with you. During this course, we'll cover all the burning questions you have about the Vue.js Composition API, such as what is a ref? Should I use ref or reactive? How does the Composition API help me? And can I just use the Options API like I'm used to? We'll also dive into the specific methods and properties the API exposes. That way, we can best wield the weapons in our arsenal. And, to top it off, we'll build a simple blog application utilizing the Composition API. That way, you can see a practical example of it in action. In order to be successful in this course, you already need to have a good grasp on the Options API and the basics of Vue.js. If that's not you, then I suggest you take some time to finish the prerequisite courses in the description below. Alright, let's get started. To begin with, let's take a look at what the Composition API is. The Composition API, sometimes referred to as CAPI for short, is an alternative way of defining component internals, such as data, methods, and computed props. It doesn't necessarily replace the Options API. The Options API is the way you wrote your components code in Vue 2. CAPI, therefore, is just an addition to the framework that can be used as an alternative or even alongside the Options API. As opposed to the Options API that allowed you to define data, methods, and so on by registering them with an Options object, the Composition API gives us access to utility functions that expose the core functionality of Vue.js. In fact, in 2019, at the time the RFC was released, it was actually called the Functions API. Some of the functions that are exposed include watch, ref, reactive, computed, and more. If you're using Vue 3, as we'll be using throughout this course, all of this is already included in the core Vue.js library. If you are wanting to use the Composition API on a Vue 2 project, you can use the Vue 2 Composition API plugin, and everything we'll cover will work mostly the same. Now that we know what it is and what version of Vue we need to use it, the big question is, so what? If you're anything like me, when you first heard about the Composition API, your first thought was, well, this looks neat, but how is this actually going to help me? To answer that question, let's take a look at some of the problems that you might encounter while using the Options API. The first problem with the Options API is that, as our components grow in functionality, the logical concerns of our component tend to be segmented across the different component options. Let's take a look at a table component as an example. Imagine we have a table component that is meant to handle loading data from an external source. It should be able to sort, filter, and paginate that data. Each of those tasks is a different logical concern. In the image you see here, you can get a feel for how each logical concern, designated by a different color, is scattered throughout the different options. That's because each concern needs to keep track of data, have methods defined, and so on. With the Options API, we must break up the logical concern in order to fit things into the different options. Thus, when making large components with the Options API, you often find yourself jumping around the file just to handle a single concern. For many components that are properly focused, this shouldn't be an issue. But some components are just a little more complex by necessity, and this can end up happening before you know it. Now, let's compare the same table component written with the composition API. Notice how all the logical concerns are grouped together now. This makes the code easier to read and reason about, especially when working in a team environment where you might not have been the one to code the component from the beginning. To summarize, the first benefit of the composition API is that it enables us to group together logical concerns for better code legibility and understanding. Now, let's take a look at the next problem with the Options API. Mix-ins are the primary mechanism for reusing logic between components in Vue 2. However, they come with a few less than desirable side effects. First, they obscure the source of component data, methods, and so on. Let's say you define a loading data property in a mixin. When you put the mixin to use in a component, just looking at the component, you'd really have no idea where this.loading is coming from, without digging into each of the component's mixins, and in a real application, there could be more than just the one mixin registered here. Furthermore, if it was a global mixin, you'd better hope the name of the data property itself is revealing enough and you're familiar enough with the plugin or library that injected it. Otherwise, there's really no way to backtrack it to its source. Not only do mixins obscure the source of shared component data, properties, methods, and so on from the developer, but also from your IDE, as it's not being mixed in via a transparent normal JavaScript mechanism. That means that features like autocomplete and IntelliSense won't work as well as they could. Secondly, mix-ins can easily lead to naming collisions. For instance, you might have a brand mix-in and a product mix-in that both set a name property. Then, attempting to use both at once would cause one of them to be lost. While both of these issues can be alleviated by prefixing mixin data properties, methods, and so on with the name of the mixin, there is nothing in the code itself that ensures that individual developers actually do this. Besides that, the prefixed properties just feel more clumsy to work with and are longer to type. Now, compare this with sharing component logic with the Composition API. In the Composition API, we can replace mix-ins with composables. The term composable is commonly used when using the Composition API to extract component logic. As you can see here, each composable can use the same data names and so on, without the fear of clashing with any other composable. That's because once you use the composable inside of a component, you have complete control to rename things as the context demands. You probably also notice that this approach allows us to easily see where each data property is coming from. The name is a variable defined on the left-hand side of an equals operator, and its source is the function called on the right-hand side. To summarize, the second benefit of the Composition API is that it allows us to more intuitively and predictably extract component logic from the template in order to share it across multiple components. In my opinion, this is the greatest strength of the Composition API and will allow for some truly game-changing practices moving forward. Finally, the last issue with Vue 2 and the Options API was that while it did support development with TypeScript, the support was limited at best and painful at worst. However, this all changes with the Composition API. With the Composition API, the initial value of refs can be used to infer their types, as can the value of computed properties be inferred from their return. Interfaces can be used when defining reactive data. And a number of other enhancements made just for TypeScript are now possible. Now that we know why it's worth using the Composition API, let's learn how all this works and how you can use it in your applications. I hope you're as excited as I am